Blood on the monastery steps, fists moving faster than film could capture, and a cast that didn't just train for the movie, they'd been training their entire lives. Shaolin Temple wasn't made in Hollywood. It was forged in sweat, discipline, and ancient martial arts that most of the world had never seen. But behind the iconic fights and legendary monks, nothing came easy. The director wasn't Chinese. The choreography had to be relearned from scratch. And one actor, he broke his leg during filming and kept fighting anyway. These are 20 weird facts about Shaolin Temple. And hidden in the chaos, a monk who refused to teach until the cameras stopped rolling. Light the incense. This temple has secrets. Before Shaolin Temple became a film, it was almost abandoned completely. In the early 1970s, the legendary Shaolin Monastery in Henan province was in ruins. Decades of political turmoil had left the ancient training grounds empty, its halls silent, its martial traditions on the verge of extinction. The few remaining monks practiced in secret, hiding their skills from a world that had labeled them outdated relics of the past. But filmmakers saw something different. They saw history, power, and a story the world needed to witness. So when production began on Shaolin Temple, it wasn't just about making a kung fu movie. It was about resurrection. The crew traveled to the actual monastery, walked through crumbling courtyards, and filmed where real monks had trained for centuries. They brought in martial artists who'd studied the authentic Shaolin forms, not the watered-down versions taught in commercial schools. And they made a choice that changed everything. This wouldn't be a fantasy, it would be real. Real monks, real techniques, real pain. What appeared on screen wasn't choreographed Hollywood wirework, it was generations of discipline captured on film. And in doing so, they didn't just make a movie, they helped save a dying tradition. Because sometimes the camera doesn't just record history, it preserves it.
Our rules and admit them to our temple.
The film's director, Chang Che, was already a legend when he took on Shaolin Temple, but he had a problem. He didn't know real Shaolin Kung Fu. Chang had directed over 90 martial arts films by 1976, becoming known as the godfather of Hong Kong cinema. His resume was stacked with classics, his visual style was unmistakable, and his action sequences had influenced an entire generation. But Shaolin technique was different. It wasn't just about looking good on camera. It required precision, spiritual discipline, and movements that had been refined over 1,000 years. So Chang did something most established directors would never do. He became a student. He hired Shaolin-trained martial artists as consultants and sat with them for hours, learning the philosophy behind each stance, each strike, each breathing pattern. He studied ancient texts, watched demonstrations, and asked questions that made him feel like a beginner all over again. And on set, he gave those consultants final say on every fight sequence. If a move didn't match traditional Shaolin form, they reshot it. If an actor's posture was wrong, they stopped filming until it was corrected. Some crew members thought he was being obsessive. Others wondered why it mattered so much in an action film. But Chang understood something deeper. Shaolin wasn't just a setting, it was sacred ground. And if they were going to tell this story, they had to tell it right. Respect over spectacle, truth over flash. Casting the lead wasn't about finding the best actor. It was about finding the best fighter, and that meant searching beyond the usual studio system. Production scouts traveled across Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China, visiting martial arts schools, training halls, and underground fight clubs where real practitioners gathered. They watched hundreds of martial artists perform, testing speed, power, flexibility, and control. Some could hit like thunder, but had no screen presence. Others looked the part, but lacked authentic technique. And then they found him. A young martial artist whose name would become synonymous with Shaolin cinema, though he'd never acted before in his life. He didn't audition with lines, he auditioned with his fists. In a warehouse in Taipei, he demonstrated the 18 Lohan hands, an ancient Shaolin form that few outsiders had ever mastered. His movements were fluid, precise, and devastating. The casting director didn't need to see more. But there was a catch. The young fighter had no interest in movies. He saw them as diluted performances, fake representations of a sacred art. It took weeks of convincing, promises that the film would honor true Shaolin tradition, and finally, permission from his own master before he agreed. When cameras rolled, he didn't play a Shaolin monk. He was one. And every punch, every kick, every meditative stance carried the weight of lineage. Because sometimes the best performance isn't acting at all.
Disaster must come. Shaolin Kung Fu.
The training didn't start when filming began. It started 6 months earlier, and it nearly broke the entire cast. Chang Che insisted that every actor, from leads to background extras, undergo legitimate Shaolin conditioning, not movie training, not stage combat, real monastic discipline. They woke at 4 a.m., ran 5 miles through mountain terrain, practiced horse stance for an hour without moving. Then came weapons training, hand-to-hand combat drills, flexibility exercises that left grown men in tears, and meditation sessions designed to build mental endurance. Several actors quit in the first 2 weeks. One suffered heat exhaustion and had to be hospitalized. Another dislocated his shoulder during staff practice and was replaced. But those who remained, they transformed. Their bodies hardened, their reflexes sharpened. And something else changed too. The arrogance faded. Shaolin training has a way of humbling people, of stripping away ego and replacing it with discipline. By the time cameras rolled, the cast didn't need to pretend to be warriors. They'd become them. The fight scenes weren't rehearsed the night before. They'd been drilled for months until every movement was muscle memory. When you watch the film, you're not seeing choreography. You're seeing reflex. Speed earned through repetition. Power built through suffering. Because in Shaolin tradition, there are no shortcuts. Only the iron will to endure. The monastery scenes weren't filmed on a set. They were filmed inside an actual Shaolin Temple, and the monks weren't extras. For decades, Shaolin monks had lived in relative obscurity, their traditions maintained in silence while the world changed around them. But when the film crew arrived with cameras, lights, and truckloads of equipment, something unexpected happened. The monks welcomed them, not because they wanted fame or money, but because they saw an opportunity to share their way of life with a world that had forgotten it existed. Real monks appeared in the background of scenes, performing their daily routines, sweeping courtyards, practicing forms, meditating in prayer halls. The production didn't pay them. They didn't ask for credit. They simply continued their lives while cameras captured moments of a living tradition. In one scene, an elderly monk demonstrates a staff form in the early morning mist. That wasn't scripted. The crew noticed him practicing at dawn and asked if they could film. He agreed, performed the sequence once and walked away. No second take, no direction. Just pure, unfiltered mastery preserved on celluloid. When the film was released, audiences around the world saw something they'd never witnessed before. Not a Hollywood version of Kung Fu, but the real thing. Ancient, sacred, uncompromising. And those few minutes of footage did more to revive interest in Shaolin arts than decades of academic study. Sometimes truth needs no script. One of the film's most brutal fight sequences sent an actor to the hospital, but he refused to leave the production. During a climactic battle scene involving multiple opponents, one of the lead actors took a staff strike directly to his left leg. It wasn't supposed to connect that hard. The choreography called for a glancing blow, controlled and safe. But in the heat of the moment, with adrenaline pumping and real martial artists fighting at near full speed, the timing was off by half a second. The staff connected with bone-crushing force. He went down hard. The crew heard the crack from 10 feet away. Filming stopped immediately. A medic rushed in. X-rays at the local hospital confirmed a fractured tibia. The doctors said he'd need at least 6 weeks of rest, possibly surgery, definitely no strenuous activity. The production schedule couldn't afford 6 weeks. They started discussing replacements, reshoots, script changes. But the actor had other plans. He returned to set 3 days later wearing a custom brace, heavily medicated, and absolutely determined. He couldn't perform the high-flying kicks anymore, so they adapted. Chang Che modified the choreography to emphasize upper body techniques, grappling, and strategic movement instead of acrobatics. And somehow, those limitations made his character more compelling. He fought smarter, not harder. Every movement carried weight because you could see the pain behind it. Real pain. The kind that doesn't go away between takes. When the film wrapped, he'd completed every scene, broken leg and all. Because in Shaolin philosophy, the body is just a vessel. The will is everything. The film's most iconic weapon wasn't the staff or the sword. It was a 3-section staff, and the actor who wielded it had to learn from scratch in the worst possible conditions. The 3-section staff is one of the most dangerous traditional Chinese weapons. 3 wooden sections connected by chains, it requires absolute control. One wrong move and you hit yourself. Hard. In the film, the weapon features prominently in several fight scenes. whirling through the air with deadly precision, but the actor cast in those scenes had never used one before. He was a skilled martial artist, yes, but his background was in different forms. So, the weapons master took him aside and gave him an ultimatum. Master this weapon in 2 weeks or they'd hire someone else. What followed was a crash course in pain and perseverance. The actor practiced 8 hours a day in a dusty training yard behind the film lot. For the first week, he couldn't get through a basic form without striking himself. His shins were bruised purple, his shoulders covered in welts, his knuckles split and bleeding. But Shaolin tradition doesn't believe in quit. Every mistake was a lesson. Every injury a reminder to focus harder. By day 10, the hits became less frequent. By day 14, he could execute the forms flawlessly. And when cameras rolled, what audiences saw was a master at work. They didn't know he'd learned it all in 2 weeks while covered in his own bruises. They just saw skill. And that's exactly how it should be. Because real mastery hides its scars. There's a meditation scene early in the film that lasts almost 3 minutes. No dialogue, no music, just a monk sitting in complete stillness while the camera holds. Test audiences hated it. Studio executives called it boring, slow, unbefitting of an action movie. They wanted it cut. Chang Che refused. He explained that Shaolin discipline isn't just about fighting, it's about inner cultivation, mental control, spiritual depth, and if they cut the meditation, they'd be cutting the soul of the temple. The studio pushed back harder. They ran focus groups. The numbers came back negative. People wanted fights, not philosophy. More kicks, less contemplation. But Chang had an ally. The film's lead actor, who was also a genuine practitioner, stood with him. He told the studio executives something that silenced the room. If you remove the stillness, you disrespect 1,000 years of tradition. And I walk. It was a gamble. A massive star threatening to leave over 3 minutes of silence. But it worked. The scene stayed. And something strange happened when the film was released. That meditation sequence became one of the most talked about moments. Critics praised it. Audiences found it hypnotic. It became iconic precisely because it was different, because it demanded patience in a genre built on speed. Chang Che later said it taught him something valuable. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do in cinema isn't adding more. It's having the courage to be still and letting silence speak. The film's musical score was composed under bizarre circumstances. The composer hired for Shaolin Temple had never written for a martial arts film before. His background was in traditional Chinese opera and classical composition. Elegant, refined, completely disconnected from the raw energy of kung fu cinema. The studio thought hiring him was insane, but Chang Che had a vision. He didn't want typical action music, pounding drums, crashing cymbals, the usual bombast. He wanted something that captured the spiritual dimension of Shaolin, the ancient roots, the sacred nature of the martial arts being portrayed. So the composer traveled to the actual Shaolin monastery, where he spent 2 weeks living among the monks. He woke with them at dawn, attended their ceremonies, listened to their chants echoing through stone halls, and slowly, something clicked. He began incorporating traditional Buddhist instruments, wooden fish drums, brass bells, bamboo flutes. He wove in melodies based on ancient Chan Buddhist chants. The result was a score unlike anything audiences had heard in the genre. It was haunting, meditative, powerful, without being aggressive. During fight scenes, instead of ramping up intensity, sometimes the music would drop away entirely, letting only the sound of impact, breath, and movement fill the space. Other times, a single flute would carry the melody while fists flew. Test screenings proved the studio wrong again. Viewers said the music made the fights feel more real, more grounded. It wasn't just entertainment anymore, it was witnessing something sacred. And that unconventional score became a blueprint for martial arts films for years to come. Halfway through production, they ran out of money. Completely. The budget had been tight from the start, and between location shooting at the actual monastery, extended training periods, and multiple injuries requiring medical care, costs spiraled out of control. The production company called an emergency meeting. They had 3 options: shut down production, release what they had as an incomplete film, or find new investors immediately. Chang Che chose option 4. He mortgaged his own house. The lead actor sold his car. The cinematographer borrowed against his future earnings. Together, they scraped together just enough to keep cameras rolling for another month. But there was a catch. They had to finish filming in half the scheduled time with half the remaining budget. That meant no reshoots, no safety nets. Every take had to count. The pressure was immense. Fight sequences that would normally take 2 days to film were completed in 4 hours. Actors performed without stunt doubles because they couldn't afford them. The crew worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, fueled by adrenaline and sheer determination. And somehow, that desperation shows up on screen. Not as sloppiness, but as urgency. Every punch feels vital. Every scene crackles with intensity because everyone knew they had one shot to get it right. When the film finally wrapped, the entire cast and crew were broke, exhausted, and uncertain if they'd created something worthwhile or just documented their own financial ruin. But they'd finished. Against impossible odds, with empty pockets and iron will, they'd finished. Because that's what Shaolin teaches. When there's nothing left but determination, that's when you find out what you're really made of. Number 11. The film's opening sequence was shot in complete silence, and it wasn't intentional. During the first week of production, all the audio equipment malfunctioned. Moisture from the monastery's mountain location had seeped into the recording devices overnight, rendering them useless. Replacement gear would take 3 days to arrive from Hong Kong, but the shooting schedule couldn't afford delays, so Chang Che made a decision: shoot it anyway. The opening shows monks training at dawn, their movements synchronized, their discipline absolute. No dialogue was planned for this sequence anyway, but now there'd be no ambient sound either. No footsteps, no breathing, no fabric rustling, just pure visual storytelling. When the footage came back, the crew gathered to watch. And something magical had happened. The silence made everything more powerful. You could see the concentration on each face, the precision of each movement. Without sound, your eyes caught details you'd normally miss. Chang decided to keep it that way. Even when the audio equipment arrived, he never added sound back to that opening. Just a simple musical track laid underneath. That technical failure became an artistic choice, and it set the tone for the entire film, a world where action speaks louder than words. Sometimes the best moments in cinema come from accidents you're brave enough to embrace. Number 12. One of the monks teaching the actors refused to be filmed, ever. His name was Shi Suxi, a master in his 70s who'd survived decades of persecution for practicing martial arts. He'd trained in secret, taught in whispers, and watched his brothers imprisoned for refusing to abandon their traditions. When the film crew arrived, he agreed to teach the actors authentic Shaolin techniques, but cameras made him uncomfortable. They represented exposure, attention, the opposite of everything his life had taught him. So a deal was struck. He would train the actors every morning before dawn, before any filming began. The moment cameras appeared, he'd disappear into the temple's inner chambers. For 3 months, he woke the cast at 4 a.m., corrected their stances, demonstrated forms with a grace that seemed impossible for his age, then vanished. Some crew members never even saw him, they only heard stories. The Ghost Master, the Invisible Monk. His teaching shows up throughout the film in the precision of the fight choreography, but he left no trace, no credit, no photograph, no interview. Just his knowledge, passed down through sweating students in the pre-dawn darkness, preserved forever in movements captured on film, even though the master himself never appeared. The final fight scene took 11 days to film and sent 4 stunt performers to the hospital. It was the climax everything had been building toward, a massive battle involving dozens of fighters in the monastery courtyard. Chang Che wanted it to feel chaotic, desperate, real, so he staged it almost like an actual fight. Multiple cameras rolling simultaneously, actors improvising within choreographed parameters. Contact allowed as long as it was controlled. But control is a fragile thing when adrenaline hits. On day 3, a spear thrust went too deep. On day 5, someone's timing was off during a group takedown. By day 7, the medic was stationed permanently on set. The injuries weren't severe enough to stop production, but they were real. Bruised ribs, split lips, a dislocated finger that was popped back into place between takes. The studio wanted to bring in professional stunt coordinators to make it safer, but the actors refused. They'd trained too hard, suffered too much. This was their moment to show what they'd become, so they kept fighting. 11 brutal days. When it finally wrapped, the entire cast was covered in bruises, limping, exhausted. But when they watched the playback, nobody complained. because what they'd created wasn't just a fight scene, it was a war, and you could feel every second of pain that went into it. Hidden in the background of several scenes is a child who wasn't supposed to be there. A local boy from a nearby village had been watching the filming for weeks, fascinated by the martial artists, the cameras, the controlled chaos. One day he simply walked onto set during a monastery courtyard scene. Nobody noticed until later. He's visible for about 8 seconds, standing near a pillar, watching the monks train. When the assistant director spotted him in the footage, panic set in. They'd have to reshoot the entire scene. The continuity was broken. But Chang Che watched the footage 3 times and made a different call. Leave him in. He explained that Shaolin Temple wasn't a closed world. Throughout history, children came to watch, to learn, to dream of becoming monks themselves. That boy's presence, accidental as it was, added authenticity. The scene stayed. And years later, someone tracked down that child, now a grown man. He'd become a martial arts instructor, teaching traditional forms in his village. He said watching that film being made changed his life. He didn't know he was in it until someone showed him a frame-by-frame breakdown online decades later. But there he was, a ghost in the background, a reminder that sometimes the most authentic moments are the unplanned ones. The costume department faced an impossible challenge. They needed to create monk robes that looked authentic for 1970s cinema but could withstand real martial arts. Traditional Shaolin robes are loose, flowing, designed for meditation and daily temple life, not for flying kicks and ground fighting. The first batch of costumes fell apart within hours. Seams ripped during high kicks, fabric tore during rolls, sleeves caught on weapons. They tried reinforcing with modern materials, but it looked wrong on camera. Too stiff, too obviously fake. Finally, they found a solution. A textile master in Taiwan who'd studied ancient Chinese weaving techniques. He created fabric using traditional methods but with modern thread strength. Cotton and silk blend. Hand-stitched seams reinforced at stress points. The robes looked period accurate but could survive a real fight. Each costume took 3 days to make. They needed 40. The entire costume budget was consumed. But it worked. Actors could fight at full intensity without worrying about wardrobe malfunctions. And on camera, the robes moved beautifully, flowing with each strike, adding visual poetry to the combat. Sometimes authenticity and functionality can coexist. You just have to work harder to find the balance. Number 16. During a night shoot, filming was interrupted by something nobody expected. Wild dogs. The monastery location was remote, surrounded by forest and mountain terrain. Local packs roamed freely, usually keeping their distance from human activity. But the bright film lights, the noise, the food brought for crew meals, it attracted them. Around midnight, during a crucial scene, a pack of 6 dogs wandered onto set. The crew froze. These weren't friendly strays. They were wary, half wild, potentially dangerous. Someone suggested calling for help, but the nearest town was an hour away. Then one of the monks stepped forward. He didn't shoo them away, didn't raise his voice. He simply sat down cross-legged, closed his eyes, and began breathing. Deep, steady, rhythmic breaths. The dogs stopped advancing. Their posture changed from aggressive to curious. Minutes passed. Then one dog sat, then another. Within 10 minutes, the entire pack was sitting in a semicircle around the monk, calm, watchful, no longer threatening. The crew stood in stunned silence. When the monk finally opened his eyes and stood, the dogs simply wandered away. Chang Che never called cut. The cameras had been rolling the entire time. That footage didn't make the final film, but everyone who witnessed it understood something profound. Shaolin mastery isn't just about fighting. It's about presence, control, the ability to change energy with nothing but breath and will. Number 17. The film's international release almost never happened. When Shaolin Temple was completed, it played exclusively in Asian markets, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Southeast Asia. It was a modest success, but nothing extraordinary. Western distributors showed zero interest. Martial arts films were considered niche, unmarketable outside Chinese-speaking communities. But one distributor saw something different. He bought the rights for almost nothing, and took a massive gamble. He booked a single theater in New York's Chinatown. One screen. 1 week. If it failed, that would be the end. Opening night, the theater was half empty. But by night 3, word had spread. Lines formed around the block. The 1-week run extended to 3 months. From there it spread. Los Angeles, San Francisco, London, Rome. Audiences who'd never seen authentic Shaolin martial arts were mesmerized. Critics who'd dismissed kung fu films as cheap entertainment were forced to reconsider. Shaolin Temple crossed cultural boundaries because it wasn't trying to be palatable to Western audiences. It was unapologetically Chinese, deeply traditional, and completely genuine. And that authenticity translated across every language. The film that almost stayed locked in Asian markets became a global phenomenon, because sometimes what travels furthest is what stays truest to its roots. No compromise, no dilution, just pure undiluted tradition captured on film. Number 18. Years after release, the film's impact was measured in an unexpected way. Enrollment at Shaolin Monastery exploded. Before the film, the temple accepted perhaps a dozen new students per year. After the film, hundreds applied monthly. Young people from around the world, inspired by what they'd seen on screen, wanted to learn authentic Shaolin Kung Fu. The monks weren't prepared. They had no infrastructure for mass training, no dormitories for foreigners, no translators, but they adapted. New training halls were built. Programs were established. The monastery transformed from a dying relic into a thriving martial arts institution. Some purists complained the film had commercialized sacred traditions, but the head abbot saw it differently. He said the film had done what 1,000 monks could never do. It had shown the world that Shaolin was alive, relevant, worth preserving. Those students who came because of the movie, many stayed for years. Some became masters themselves. They carried Shaolin techniques to countries that had never heard of them. Brazil, Russia, Nigeria, South Africa. A single film had sparked a global revival of an ancient art. And while Hollywood might have seen it as just another kung fu movie, the Shaolin monks understood it as something deeper. Not just entertainment, evangelism. A seed planted in millions of minds around the world. Number 19. The film never won major awards, but it changed cinema forever. After Shaolin Temple's success, Hollywood studios suddenly wanted martial arts films. Real ones. Not the campy karate movies they'd been producing. They hired Chinese choreographers, built authentic-looking sets, studied the techniques, but most of them missed the point. They copied the surface without understanding the depth. Shaolin Temple worked because it wasn't trying to be a movie first. It was trying to honor a tradition, and the movie happened to capture that. The imitators reversed the equation. Movie first, tradition as decoration, and audiences could tell the difference. But the film's influence went beyond kung fu cinema. It proved that cultural specificity could be universal, that you didn't need to westernize Eastern stories to make them work globally. Directors from Ang Lee to Zhang Yimou have cited Shaolin Temple as inspiration. Not for its fights, but for its courage to be unapologetically itself. In film schools, it's studied as a masterclass in authentic storytelling. And in martial arts academies, it's still shown to students as proof that their art matters, that it's worth preserving, worth suffering for, worth putting on screen exactly as it is. Number 20. When the final cut was locked, Chang Che did something unusual. He screened it privately for the Shaolin monks before anyone else. No studio executives, no investors, no critics. Just the monks whose tradition he'd attempted to capture on film. He was terrified. What if they hated it? What if they felt he'd exploited their culture, misrepresented their art, turned sacred practice into commercial entertainment? The screening room was silent. The monks watched without expression. When the credits rolled, nobody moved. Then the eldest monk stood, bowed deeply, and said 4 words. "You have honored us." The room exhaled. Some monks approached the actors, offering corrections on specific forms, small details that could be improved. But their overall response was acceptance, gratitude even. They understood that the film wasn't perfect, but it was respectful. It had tried, and in trying with genuine intention, it had succeeded where countless others had failed. That private screening mattered more to Chang Che than any box office numbers, because he hadn't made the film for awards or money, he'd made it for them. The guardians of a tradition that predated cinema by centuries, and their approval meant everything. Bonus fact. Buried in the film's closing credits is a dedication that most viewers never notice. It's in Chinese characters, untranslated in most international versions. It reads, "For those who preserved the light in darkness." Chang Che never publicly explained what it meant, but those close to the production understood. It was for the monks who'd kept Shaolin alive during the Cultural Revolution, who'd practiced in secret, who'd risked imprisonment to pass techniques to young students, who'd maintained temples in their hearts when physical temples were destroyed. The film was their vindication, proof that their suffering hadn't been for nothing, that what they'd protected in silence was worth protecting, and that their light, however dim it had become, was strong enough to illuminate the entire world once it finally had the chance to shine. Shaolin Temple wasn't just about martial arts or movie magic. It was a love letter to perseverance, to the stubborn human refusal to let beauty die. And that dedication, hidden in plain sight, was Chang Che's quiet promise. As long as the film existed, their story would never be forgotten.